greatest fear that I have is that when the Russians do attack and it becomes abundantly clear that Ukraine is finished, I mean, it's already obvious to anybody who visits the place for any length of time, it's in ruins. I think we've grossly miscalculated. Putin had made several speeches over the last 20 years, repeatedly saying, please do not advance the border to Russia. Do not try to transform Ukraine into a hostile actor. And the president said, President Trump I'm talking about now, said just a few weeks ago, said, look, we can handle Russia. We can handle China. We understand those issues. He does. He knows there's no reason to go to war with anybody. He said the real problem for us right now is the open border. And not just the open border in the south, because the northern border is equally open. We just don't pay nearly as much attention to it. And it's also a highway for drugs and criminality into the United States. There is no rule of law in our country. Where I grew up in North Philadelphia has from time to time been a combat zone. I tell you right now, it's a war zone. There is no rule of law there any longer. Criminality is rampant. And the American people, yes, they're beginning to figure it out, but we're about to go into a serious economic crisis. And once you start talking to people that can't get enough food, who can't afford to buy the food because the prices are so high, you end up the way the Parisian population did in 1789. And we're headed in that direction right now. It takes real leadership by the president, but he's going to need an army of people to fight with him. He's got to be prepared to come into this city, clean it out, and start over. He's got to have foot soldiers in every precinct, in every state. It's the only way to win. We didn't have that the last time. We've got to have that, or there's no chance whatsoever for us.
So you've been pretty outspoken also about sort of the never-ending, war in Ukraine, which I feel like, again, first it was just a, $130 billion proxy war. Now, not surprisingly to anyone who's been watching for the last, 7 or 8 years, we have boots on the ground there, and they're doing that without congressional approval and without the approval of the American people. Just another money pit, creating the next class of sort of Ukrainian oligarch. But do we even know because they haven't been clear to me, what would victory be like in Ukraine? I mean, I know they tried sort of sidelining my father with that at the CNN town hall. He's like, I'm not thinking about victory one way or the other. I want people to stop dying. And that doesn't seem to be very clear to these people, where there's a binary victory. This means it's like they're playing Call of Duty, not actually dealing with real lives. Trump said we should be doing everything to stop the bloodshed. Do you agree? What do you see happening there? And what is the end game if that's not correct?
Well, for the globalists that are running the show, this is the globalist neocon elite, both on the Hill as well as in the White House, and these elites in Europe, particularly in Paris, Berlin, London, they're all interested in seeing BlackRock take over Ukraine, number one, so that it can be systematically stripped of its resources and turned into a subjugated state that belongs to the larger globalist elites. But they also want to see that happen to Russia, which is why this war was never about Ukraine. It was always about what can be done to destroy Russia. And of course, since the people in charge didn't perform any strategic analysis, they never thought about purpose, method, or end state, they concluded that Russia today is still the Russia of 1992. It's weak. It's prostrate. Its economy is ineffective. Remember the McCain statement? Oh, Russia is Spain with a gas station. All of these arrogant displays of American hubris, treating Russia as though it was a third-class nation with a fourth-class military. Well, we're getting an education right now. We paid no attention to the Russians who had legitimate concerns about what we were doing in eastern Ukraine. We were building an army to attack them. We put a hostile government into that country in 2014. And we kept telling them that it made no difference to us what they thought or what they cared about. They said, we don't want NATO on our border. No one paid attention. President Trump tried to listen, but he was surrounded by people who subverted him, people who were not loyal to the president, who took an oath of obedience to the orders of the president and then ignored them. So what's the outcome? You've got a very serious war that could become regional, even global. And no one in the White House seems to really grasp that. But we're losing. The globalists are losing. And when the ground dries, and in June, you're going to see a massive Russian offensive, and most of what we call this thing called Ukraine is going to be swept away, especially that government in Kiev. But that government doesn't represent the interests of the Ukrainian people. They represent the interests of this globalist elite who are interested in resources and stripping them and using them and exploiting them to make money.
Yeah, and there are also people that don't seem to have any of America's interests at heart, even if America's the guy funding all of this to the tune of 130. And, that'll double and triple, and the Pentagon lost 220, they misplaced $220 billion in their budget. If you lost $6 in your, IRS statement, they'd be auditing you, but they can lose 220. So I imagine most of that went to Ukraine, but it feels like, the biggest threat to America is actually what's happened to the petrodollar, when you have Putin now talking with the Saudis and Putin now talking with Xi, and you get rid of the petrodollar, and all of a sudden all that borrowing that we do, where we're living way above our means, that's no longer possible, plausible, or worse. And
that's right.
It seems like we've opened the door for that. So, I guess that works for the globalists because they're probably the guys coming up with this idea, and they don't care about taking and getting rid of American hegemony.
That's
a real problem for America. But again, this is still the Americans pushing this, even though it's literally happening before our eyes, and everyone's pretending like this is a non-issue. Because I guess it's a non-issue if you're in France or the UK or any of the other places, because you get to knock America down a peg. But what that does to the American people is disastrous.
No, I think what you're seeing is this war has become financial as well as military. And the globalists understand that they're going to lose this war. And what will come of this is that the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, are going to be increased by 81 additional members. And all of these people are going to go to a currency that is backed by gold. And once they go to that currency backed by gold, whether it is one currency or a basket of currencies, it doesn't make any difference. Yes, we are in a lot of trouble. The globalists know that, and it is why they are so desperate right now. And the greatest fear that I have is that when the Russians do attack and it becomes abundantly clear that Ukraine is finished, I mean, it's already obvious to anybody who visits the place for any length of time, it's in ruins. But once that occurs, I fear that there will be pressure to commit U.S. forces in Poland and Romania, along with Polish forces and potentially Romanian ones, to Western Ukraine. And if that occurs, the gloves will come off because, truthfully, thus far, Putin has exercised tremendous restraint, tremendous patience. He does not want a war with the West. If he wanted that, we'd already have it. But if we intervene in Western Ukraine, it's over. We'll be in a full-fledged war.
Expand on that a little bit, because it's sort of interesting. You say, hey, this started, maybe Putin was going to do it anyway, but the reality, this started, in my opinion, because, NATO was talking about taking let's call it a 500-mile-long buffer zone that has been historically a buffer zone since basically World War II, which was the Ukraine, and moving NATO's borders towards Russia. Now, maybe Putin was going to do it anyway. I'm not saying he's, a good guy or a nice guy. I'm not apologizing for him, but no one seems to talk about that the movement of and the talk about moving NATO onto Russia's border when you had this very large buffer zone of the Ukraine was sort of the excuse that they needed. I mean, it is as though we were goading him into this to begin with. What are your thoughts on all of that?
I think we grossly miscalculated. Putin had made several speeches over the last 20 years, repeatedly saying, please do not advance the border to Russia. Do not try to transform Ukraine into a hostile actor, an actor with hostile intentions towards Russia. What happens in Ukraine is of existential strategic interest to us, just as theoretically what happens in Mexico is of existential strategic interest to us, although this administration has decided to ignore it. That's going to come back to haunt us. And if you're looking for future conflict, that's where to look for it, not in Europe and not in Asia. But the point is that Putin wasn't pulling any wool over anyone's eyes, and Putin absolutely didn't want a war. If you go back and look at the force that he sends into Ukraine earlier in February of 2022, he goes in with about 90,000 troops. He limits his advances to the periphery. because he expected that we would negotiate, that he would demonstrate that this was serious and that Russia wanted its population in eastern Ukraine, which is really Russian, to have equal rights before the law. He wanted to end the oppression of the Russians that lived there. And he wasn't going to surrender Crimea. The reason he went into Crimea is he was afraid it was going to be turned into a U.S. naval base by the Ukrainians at the earliest opportunity. He wasn't going to allow that to happen. Now, he went along and thought that he might get a negotiated settlement, and he finally figured out after several months, nobody's going to talk to me, especially after Biden said, our goal is regime change. Our goal is to get rid of Putin. And our goal is ultimately to divide Russia into constituent parts, then exploit it. All of his supporters, his staffers, everyone in the globalist camp knows this is the truth. The so-called oligarchs, Kolomoisky, Soros, and others are all part of this. None of this is news. Finally, he said, enough's enough. He stopped. They set up a strategic defense. They ran an economy of force mission. And now they have a force in place that can go as far as it needs to go, which includes to the Polish border. They have a plan for a 31-month war against us if we insist on fighting it. And we are in no shape to fight a war. We can't even recruit for the United States Army or the Marines. The Marines are running around trying to recruit illegals and are being encouraged to do so by the administration. Is that what you want in the ground force to fight for this country? Forget it. It's not going to work.